So now we have a means of authenticating users on the back end, and we need to work on the front end to actually create a login screen and then decide what we want to have protected and what we want to have available to everyone. So I have the application running right now, and obviously we want this function, add movie, and this function, manage catalog, and this delete button all to be protected. And when I say the delete button, I mean even though the button may not be visible, the root behind it has to be protected as well, so no one can call that root directly. And delete movies without even seeing this screen. So those are the things we want to be protected. And in fact, I don't even want these two menu items to show up at all until someone is logged in. So maybe what I'll do is I'll add a link up here that says login. And clicking on that will take you to a login screen, which I'll write as a component. And that login screen will allow the user to enter an email address and a valid password, and if they successfully authenticate, they'll get their JWT handed back to them. And at that point, these two menu items should show up, and the login should change to log out. So there's quite a few steps necessary to make that take place. And one of the things we're going to have to think about, of course, is how to share that token. Once we get it, we need to store it somewhere so we have access to it when we need to use it. So obviously we're going to be lifting state as well. So let's get started. So I'll go back to my IDE, and I'm looking at the front-end code, and I'm looking at app.js. And of course, this is the parent component. It's the one that loads other components. And since we're going to be lifting state, perhaps we should convert this from a mere function into an actual component. Unfortunately, that's pretty easy. So I'll export a default class instead of a function. And that means I don't need these parentheses. And this has to extend component right there. So that imports it for us. That's great. And of course, this means we need to make a couple of other changes. For example, we can't just return. This has to be the render function. So we'll change that into a function. Go down to the very bottom here and add a closing parentheses or curly bracket. And I'll format this. Great. So now it's a component. That was pretty easy. But of course we want to do more than that. First of all, let's give it a constructor, which takes the argument props. And then we have to call super props. And now we'll set some state. And the only thing I care about at this level is my JavaScript web token. So I'll just default it to this. This.state equals, and I'll call my entry JWT, which seems logical, and I'll make it an empty string by default. So there's my constructor. But of course, we're going to be lifting state. So let's create a function here where we can actually lift the necessary things to our state. And I'll call it handle JWT change. The same kind of logical naming convention I used last time. And it will take one argument, the JavaScript or JSON web token, and it just calls this.setState, and all we care about is JWT, which is set to JWT. Okay. And now in our constructor, we'll bind this. This.handle JWT change takes the argument of this.handle JWT change.bind and hand it this. Okay, so we're going to need that for sure. The other thing we're going to want is a logout function, which we'll just create right now using the arrow syntax. So we have access to this, and I'm missing a pointy bracket there. That's better. This.setState, and all we have to do to log someone out is set JWT back to being an empty string. And that will be the logic we use now. We might change that later on, but I'm going to make the assumption that if JWT has a valid value, then the user is logged in. If JWT is empty, then the user is logged out, which seems pretty straightforward. So we'll go with that for now. Now, the next thing I want to do is down here, let's change this top part so we can have that login/logout. So that means the link is going to change depending upon the state. If JWT has some value, then it's a logout button. Otherwise, it's a login button. So in my render function, I'll just create a variable, which I'll call let login link. And that's just declaring the variable. And then we'll just do a simple test. Not else set, let. There. If this.state.jwt is exactly equal to an empty string, then set the one value, else set another value. And what I'll do here is simply say login link is equal to, I'll use link, which I'll allow my ID to import for me, if it's not there already, and I think it is, to, and we'll just use a non-existent root right now, to login. And we'll set that to login. Otherwise, let me copy this and paste that, link to, and I'll call this one logout, which doesn't exist, and it doesn't matter because I'm actually going to call onClick. And that will be equal to this.logout. And that will log the user out, and of course the label should be logout. Okay, so now I have this variable, and I can use it. So down here, I'll simply take this h1 tag and put it in its own column, div class name equals call, and I'll give it a little bit of margin on the top, say mt-3. And I'll get rid of this and move the closing div down where it belongs, right here. And then I'll add another column. Div class name equals call, and again some margin at the top, mt-3. And this one I'll also say, put the text at the end, to the right in other words. And in there, I'll simply put login link. Okay, so if I save that and go back and look at my screen now in my web browser, I should have a login screen. And there it is, a login button. Perfect. Now if I go back here, now if I put some values in the state in my constructor, if I change that to say some x's, and go back and look at my web browser now, that should change to log out. It does, perfect. Now let's also take care of these menu items. So I'll go back down to where those menu items actually show up, and they show up right here. So I want these two LIs not to be visible unless someone is logged in. And we know how to do that. That's pretty straightforward. We can just put a condition in here. So this.state.jwt, if that's not exactly equal to empty, and then use the double ampersands and move this down to here, and then wrap everything in a fragment right here, fragment, and then move the closing fragment down to here, and hit return and format everything. So right now, in my state, I have it equal to XXX. So those should show up. Let's go back and look. Yep, they're still there. But if I remove these and have the state default to being empty and go back, we have login and those two menu items have disappeared. Perfect. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is to create our login component. So let me go back to my IDE. And in components, I want to create a new component. So I'll right click on that and choose new file. And I'll just call it login.js. And I'll use my shorthand to do the heavy lifting for me to start with. And I'll say export default class login extends component. And it's going to have a constructor, which will take props as an argument, which means I need to call super.props, or superprops, try that again. Okay. And it also is going to have some state. So I'll say this.state, and what do I want to have in my state? Well, I know I'm going to have two form values, email, which will default to empty, and password, which will default to empty. I'm also going to be checking for an error, probably, so I'll put that as null. And I'm definitely going to have errors, the array, which will default to an empty array. And I'm probably also going to use an alert, that nice alert component we built a little while ago. So if someone logs in with invalid information, I can give them some visual feedback. And it will have a default type of d-none, so it's hidden to start with. And it will also have a message, which will be empty to start with. And that should be enough to get us started. Okay, so that's our constructor. We know we're going to have form validation, so we're going to want to add probably the same kind of logic we did on our edit movie screen. So I'll put in the handle change right now. We're going to have that. Handle change is a function, and that will be equal to, with the argument event, an arrow function. And just like we did last time, we'll say let value equal this.target.value, and let name equal this.target.name. So if we're coming from the email entry, for example, the name will be email and the value will be whatever the current value of that form component is. And all we're going to do is call this.setState, like we did last time. This.setState, and we're going to have previous state, so we don't lose anything that's in there already. And we'll use an arrow function, and it's a bracket like that, then a curly bracket. And we'll put ... prev state, and then whatever the name is, followed by value. And that should be it. Okay, so we have handle change. That's all set up. Now back up in our constructor, let's do the necessary binding. This.handleChange will be equal to this.handleChange.bind this. And we're also going to, of course, have a form submit. So let's get that started right now. Handle submit. Instead of submitting the form, we're going to call this function. And it will again take the EVT. And for right now, we'll just say EVT prevent default. And we'll take care of this in a subsequent lecture. And again, we need to bind that. This.handleSubmit is equal to this.handleSubmit.bind this. Okay, and because we have a form with potentially errors, we're also going to want a hasError function, which will take key as its argument, and return this.state.errors.index of whatever the key is not equal to -1, just like we did in our edit movie component. And now finally, we have our render function. Okay, so what do we want to have in our render function? Well, I know it's probably going to be in a fragment, so I'll wrap the whole thing in a fragment just to be safe. And if I don't need that, I'll get rid of it later. Okay, we're definitely going to want a title, H2. Login seems logical. We're probably at this point also going to want to have our alert component. So let's let our IDE auto import that for us. Alert, right there. And I'll just close the tag down here and put in my two default values, the properties. Alert type is equal to this.state.alert.type, and alert message is equal to this.state.alert.message. Okay, so there's our alert component. Now we can start the form proper. So I'll put an HR maybe before the alert, right up here, just to give it some nice spacing. HR, and self-close that tag. Now let's create our form. Form. And I'll give it a class name, just a little bit of margin at the top, or padding at the top, pt-2, or 3, that should be enough. And we also want to have the onSubmit, which will be this.handleSubmit, right there. So that will prevent our form from, it'll give our form something to do, but it will not allow the form to submit and do a server round trip. Now I only want two inputs in this form, email and password. So it would seem logical to use our pre-built input components. So we'll do that, and we'll let our ID import the necessary code for us. Input, and I'll just give it a blank line and close the tag. And our first one will be the email. So title equals email. And then the type would be the HTML5 email type. And the name will be email again. And we'll also bind that to a handle change function. Handle change will be equal to this dot handle change. And we need to give it a class name. And we'll use that same logic we did last time. So equals this dot has error. And we're going to pass it the name of the field, email. And we'll do our ternary. Is dash invalid if there's an error, otherwise nothing. And our next one is the error div. And that will be equal to this dot has error. And again, hand it email, the name of the field. And we want it to be red, so text dash danger if there's an error, otherwise hide it, d dash none. And the message. Error MSG is equal to please enter a valid email address. Okay, now I'll copy this entire thing and just modify it for the password. Paste that in there, and I'll format everything. And let's change this to password, and this to password lowercase, and copy that, and paste it here, and paste it here, and change the message to please enter a password. Okay. Now after those inputs, we'll put an HR, and then we'll just put a button. Button class name equals button, say button dash primary, and call it a login. Okay, so there is our form. So we got our login component. There's no errors showing up at all. So let's go back to app.js. Let's import that. Import login from components, login. And now down here, we need to route to that. So I'll put it right here. And we'll just use route. I'll make this one exact. Path equals /login. And we want to route this, but we want to route it with the props. And we also want to bind it with the handle JWT change function so we can lift state. So the syntax is a little bit different than, for example, one genre above, but not that different. Component equals, and we're going to hand it the props. And we're going to use the login component, and we're going to include all the props, and we're going to use that when we, for example, redirect the user from the login screen somewhere else after they successfully authenticated. And then we need to bind handle JWT change equal to this dot handle JWT change, and then we close our tag and we close our root tag. Okay, so that should be enough to get us started. So let's go see if we can see our form. Let's try login, and there is our form. So now that we have a form, the next step is to actually go back to our login component right here and actually do the necessary logic here to validate the data, provide feedback if there's a problem, and then make a request to our backend and try to authenticate. And we'll get started on that in the next lecture.